Well, good afternoon to everybody, and uh, thank you for making the time in the midst of the third wave of our pandemic. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Vishwas Satgar. I chair the board of the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center that's hosting today's workshop on a climate justice deal for South Africa. I'm also an academic at Wits University. Now, most of you in this conversation are aware that the climate crisis is worsening. We are at 417 parts per million carbon concentration, way beyond the safe zone of 350 parts per million. Despite the impact of our pandemic on bringing down emissions, in general, though, we are on a negative trajectory. Southern Africa is hitting at twice the global average. And even in the midst of the pandemic, we've been living with the worst drought in our history, particularly in the Eastern Cape. So the climate crisis is upon us, and so are other crises. They are interconnected and they are feeding off each other. And this is a very, very important rationale and reason for us having this convening, as well as initiating the Climate Justice Charter process in South Africa. Last year, on 16th October, we took the Climate Justice Charter to South Africa's parliament, and as citizens, we demanded that it be adopted as per Section 234 of the South African Constitution, which provides for charters to be adopted to complement our Constitution. We debated with some of the political parties there, and of course, most of them displayed a lack of understanding and even a weakness around grasping the scale of the challenge. We have not heard back from our parliament, but despite that, we will be returning this year on October 16th, under the banner, "The world and South Africa is watching. Why hasn't Parliament adopted the Charter?" At the same time, the Charter is very, very critical of business as usual thinking. It sees the contemporary approach to economics and economic policy as a serious problem. I mean, the assumptions that it works with, and particularly sort of neoliberal economics of natural capital, of reducing all of nature to capital, is a very serious problem. And so the Charter has a critique of economics. It sees economics as part of the problem. At the same time, it recognizes that we need to have a macro intervention. We need to be able to present a different paradigm to address primarily the climate crisis, but in addressing the climate crisis, addressing a whole host of other shocks impacting our society and driving us towards socio-ecological systems collapse. So the Charter is calling for a climate justice deal, which is what this workshop is about. It's about developing that framework. It's about doing the next big part of the work around the Climate Justice Charter process. Now, in trying to move in this direction, we felt that it was important for us to draw on environmental economics, which goes back to the 1960s, and the kind of offerings that it has to make to shaping this new paradigm. We also recognize that we have to think in inter and transdisciplinary terms. We need earth science, we need the natural sciences to also meet the social sciences in how we think about this new paradigm. Now, I think what we are trying to achieve in this exercise is how do we reposition how we think about the economy and economics? How do we place it as a subset of society and ecological relations? In other words, a subordinate subset. Because the world we are living in right now has placed economy and economics at the top of everything. It is something that is embracing everything and all of us and smothering us actually to death. And so how do we re-embed and rethink economic economy in a way that ensures that it is limited from the standpoint of society and ecological relations? Now, this is a problem that ecological economics has with somebody called Herman Daly who's branched out and developed one variant of ecological economics. He has something interesting about macroeconomics, that if you think about it as an analogy, if you think about it as a ship, macroeconomics from an ecological point of view should basically ensure that we do not fill the ship to the point that it sinks. Every ship has a certain weight that it can carry, okay? And if you surpass that weight, those ships will sink. And so Herman Daly is saying, well, can an ecological approach to macroeconomic questions ensure that we don't sink the ship? And he's devoted a big part of his academic and intellectual life to grappling with this question. At the same time, we are faced with an economy that is crashing, that's run into serious problems in the midst of the COVID pandemic and lockdown, and all its weaknesses have been revealed to us. Over 2.5 decades of the same thinking of marketization, financialization, deep globalization, and so on, has basically revealed a society that is deeply in crisis. At the same time, our rulers are not willing to think beyond that. They're not willing to think about the crisis moment as an opportunity to reposition economics and the economy. And so, hence, this climate justice deal project, as part of the climate justice charter process, is very, very important. And to help us move down this road, we've identified, we think, some of the best Marxist, ecologist, economists, some of the best heterodox economists and progressive economists to think with us around this. And so we gave them a brief, we gave them a terms of reference to help us think about a climate justice deal based on the climate justice charter. And we said, well, how do we elaborate a macroeconomic approach to the climate justice deal? How do we think about socio-ecological restructuring from the standpoint of a new paradigm of macroeconomics? How do we inspire this break with current thinking that is reproducing multiple crises? How do we advance in an awareness that we thrive and coexist on one planet? So in other words, the nature has intrinsic value, and that we don't have to reduce it to natural capital. And of course, we find egalitarian solutions in this process and how we're thinking about consumption and resources, and of course, cooperation and solidarity. So the first brief was to develop a global ecological critique of macroeconomics and to help us think, what are its limits from that perspective? Do we have to continue with the growth-centered paradigm of mainstream economics? I mean, what does growth really mean for economies, for societies, and for the crises that we are living through? Of course, there's a big debate about degrowth, but what does that mean in the South African context, and where should we go? So that's one of the crucial issues around the critique of macroeconomics. The other is, again, how do we treat nature? Do we see it as natural capital, as ecosystem services to be exploited? And where does mass consumption fit in? Because the world and the society that capitalism has constructed is a world without limits. So you can shop until you drop, you can consume as much as you want, etc. But there are limits, there are ecological limits. And particularly one approach to ecological economics based in the laws of thermodynamics tells us, well, if we use more matter and energy, we are basically moving towards greater chaos with the throughput of all of that. How do we think about ecological problems with new monetarism, Keynesian and neo-Keynesian approaches? What is a decolonial perspective on development? Now, these are all very big questions. I mean, is the template for where we are going Euro-America? Is that what we are trying to reproduce? But yet the average carbon footprint and ecological footprint of an American person is deadly. The ecological footprint requires 4 planets. Okay, now is that what we consider to be the good life? Is that what we consider to be development? Is that where we are going? And then, of course, what are the alternatives to growth-centered macroeconomics? And to think about how this relates to policy for the deep, just transition. We've also asked our colleagues to help us think about a climate justice diagnosis of the South African macroeconomy, to think about the climate risks and to cost out these risks for us. I mean, what did the recent drought cost us? What did recent tornado activity in UKZN cost us? What did storm surges and flooding cost us? We need to really bring this to the fore. One of the most conservative neoclassical economists who won a Nobel Prize argued that climate only costs 0.2% of GDP. And basically, he was arguing that because all the economic activity that he was measuring and enumerating and so on was happening inside. Okay, so as long as these activities are happening inside, climate is not a problem. So there you can see with this illustration, this example of the madness within neoclassical economics. So we've asked our colleagues to help us think about how we ensure that climate justice becomes a macroeconomic objective of our country. It guides institutions, it guides how we think about policy, it guides how we think about planning, and so on. And then, of course, we've also asked our colleagues to help us think about pillars, macroeconomic pillars as transition. So we are facing the risk of socio-ecological systems collapsing. But in the charter, we've also put forward systemic alternatives that can ensure these systems can be regenerated and restructured and meet the needs of society. But again, I mean, how do we approach, for example, the question of public goods? And what are the numbers for this? Okay, public goods are going to be very, very important. We're seeing the failings of our public healthcare system right now. The ANC got a disaster. Okay, we went into this pandemic with 5,000 ICU beds, and over 90% of those mainly in private hospitals. Is that the kind of public healthcare system we're getting into a climate-driven world? Where does public transport, clean energy public transport, fit into all of this? So we've asked them to think about how we finance some of these alternatives. Where do we get the money from? So the dominant narrative is that the state is bankrupt, and hence we are in a process of austerity and cutting our macroeconomic budget. So we've asked our colleagues to counter this. Is there another way in which we can leverage resources and financing and take our country in a different direction and give substance to this idea of climate jobs and a whole host of other alternatives like community and socially owned renewable energy? And then, of course, how do we confront the power issues around a climate justice deal for South Africa? So in short, this is the mandate and the terms of reference that we've given to our colleagues who will be presenting to us today. We have a very focused program. We have a paper from Patrick Bond. Many of you know Patrick. He's a professor now at the University of Western Cape, I think. And he is renowned for his work on climate justice, on the political economy of Africa, on unequal ecological exchange, and so on. And so this mandate was given to Patrick to help us think about where do we go. We also reached out to the Institute for Economic Justice with the same terms of reference to say, well, draw on your strengths and let's see how you think with us to clarify this macroeconomic climate justice deal for South Africa. What kind of thinking can you share with us from your platform? And then similarly, we reached out to one of our leading heterodox economists, Duma Kubule, to also think us with this terms of reference. And then, of course, we also have Asghar Adilzadeh, a very prominent macroeconomist, a modeler, who's done amazing work for us on modeling a basic income grant. It's one of the systemic alternatives in the Climate Justice Charter. Let's be reminding us about the work he's done for us recently. So all of this work is basically informed by the charter. It's informed by a workshop we had also late last year, where we commissioned a few think pieces. Out of those think pieces, we put together this terms of reference, and we commissioned the work that's going to be presented to us today. So without a further ado, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to hand over to Patrick for 20 minutes to take us through his presentation and his input. I'll do a 5-minute response, and then we'll have other comments and engagements. We'll similarly do the same with Carolee, and then, of course, Duma and Asghar.